אנו מכריזים בזאת
Hello viewers, this is Barry Shaw of the Israel Institute of Strategic Studies, and this is the view from Israel. We've just come out of another round of violence instigated by Hamas with unprovoked rocket attack, and we thought it would be good to do a summary of where we are following the result, why it began, why it finished, and the way forward. And I can think of no better guest to have on the show than Boaz Ganor, the founder and executive director of the International Institute for Counterterrorism at IDC Herzliya. It's a world-renowned institute of the world of counterterrorism, defense and security, political science, and military intelligence. So, Boaz, welcome to the show. Thank you very much for being my special guest today.
Thank you for having me, Barry.
Tell us, what is ICT? What is the Israel International Institute for Counterterrorism? How was its genesis created by you? And what is its role for international policymakers?
Thank you for asking, Barry. Actually, ICT is celebrating its 25th anniversary as we speak. ICT was established within the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya 25 years ago, in 1996, by a few people that gathered together, and I refer to the outgoing head of the Israeli Mossad at that time, Mr. Shabtai Shavit, the president of IDC, Professor Uriel Reichman, and myself, together with few others. We've decided that it's about time to establish an academic institute, a center of excellence, that would learn, would examine, would analyze the phenomenon of terrorism, not from an ivory academic tower, but from taking academic tools and practices in order to get a better understanding of the phenomenon and therefore create better policies and practices in countering this phenomenon. So the ICT stands for the International Institute for Counterterrorism, by the way, not the Israeli, because we saw terrorism as an international phenomenon and not just a local sporadic event or case in Israel or in the Middle East. And since then, 5 years after the creation, after the foundation of the ICT, the worst atrocity of terrorism ever occurred. And I refer to 9/11, of course. And after that, the DHS was created in the United States, and the DHS have opened 12 centers of excellence for counterterrorism and homeland security in 12 American universities. And in the bids the DHS have published, they've mentioned in some of them that the model is the ICT in Israel. Since then, almost every respected university in the world have established an academic institute, a think tank, a team, a center of excellence that is dealing with counterterrorism, and many of them are coming to ICT to learn from us, to learn from the Israeli experience and from our academic experience. I will summarize in a joke, and don't take it too seriously. Most of the terrorists around the world are praying with their faces to Mecca. We are arguing that most of the counterterrorism experts in the world are praying with their faces to Herzliya.
Okay. Well, it's true that your institute is not an ivory tower one. It's one in which you are in contact daily with some of the movers and shakers in intelligence, defense security, the interdisciplinary aspects of terrorism that is often referred to by you. Can you explain to our viewers what you would call the interdisciplinary aspects of terrorism and the necessity of democracies to understand the importance of this discipline? And it's something I think that most democratic governments lack today.
Thank you. Well, let's think together. Which academic discipline is relevant when we are trying to analyze the phenomenon of terrorism, when we are trying to understand the phenomenon, when we are trying to contend with this phenomenon of terrorism? Well, political science, international relations, quite clear. You can add to that psychology, sociology, law, economics, computer science, philosophy. Practically, between you and me, nobody's listening. Every field, every discipline, every academic discipline has relevancy to terrorism, directly or indirectly. And once you understand that, you figure out that terrorism is one of the most interdisciplinary phenomena, or should I say, multidisciplinary phenomena. Now, with all the respect that I do have to the practitioners around the world, to the security services, law enforcement agencies, political decision makers, they do not have the ability to bring to the table all of those academic tools in order to comprehend that phenomenon the way we believe it's needed to deal with it. They are doing their job, sometimes even a remarkable job. But we are bringing to the table another dimension, or should I say dimensions in plural, which if you bring them and you use them in a sophisticated, calculated manner, the way that we do, you synergize the capability to contend with the phenomenon of terrorism. So the whole idea of ICT, and that's the way that we have been built from day one, is that we are bringing to the table representatives, academics, scholars from all of those disciplines on one hand, together with veterans of the Israeli security agencies, Mossad, Shabak, military intelligence, police, prison system, national security council. More than 150 of those former heads of those agencies are now fellows of the Institute and quite active in our activities.
All right, let's examine, for instance, one terrorist organization, and we'll pick an internationally designated terror organization, and let's dig into the weeds and see how this impacts what we could call the understanding or misunderstanding of a lot of the countries who one would assume would be siding with us against the terrorist organization, taking what has been described in America as an even-handed approach. Summarize how you saw the recent Hamas violence, the background and the outcome. And would you say that Hamas has come out of this stronger or weaker, despite the fact that they brought down ruin on Gaza because of their unprovoked terror attack, rocket attack against Israel?
It's a great question, Barry. And let me say, as an opener, that we cannot examine Hamas by itself, because Hamas was and probably will be in the future having tight connections with Iran and with Hezbollah, the proxy of Iran. So whatever we had to face 2 weeks ago in Israel, in the Guardians of the Wall operation in Gaza, everything, including high trajectory launching rockets towards Israel, civilian cities and neighborhoods, including the what we call the metro, the underground facilities, tunnels that they've built under almost all the territory of Gaza Strip, all the so-called surprises that they plan and prepare, like suicide drones and so on and so forth. All of that they learn from one source and one source only, and this is Iran and Hezbollah. So you can imagine that it didn't come as a surprise to Israel. Hamas is using this arsenal that they got the money in order to fund it. They got the technology, they got the know-how from Hezbollah. They use it in order to extort Israel and in order to shift the attention of their own constituency, the Palestinians, from the problems that they have in Gaza, their severe way and almost very difficult day-to-day life that they have there, which is a direct outcome of Hamas policy. And once the criticism starts to raise in Gaza, The old solution that works time and again is to start clashes with Israel, and then everybody is united against the so-called external villain, i.e. Israel. What happened 2 weeks ago? Hamas suddenly started by launching 9 rockets towards Jerusalem. The official excuse that Hamas was giving is that they would like to express their support, the protection that they give to the Palestinians in Jerusalem, and they use the slogan, which unfortunately is used time and again. They are the protectors of Jerusalem, the protectors of the holy places, and the protectors of Al-Aqsa, as if there is any kind of danger to Al-Aqsa or the Muslim holy places in Jerusalem or something like that. But if we really like to analyze what caused them to do so at that particular period of time, we can come up with a few reasons. For once, I would say the political tension and rivalry within Hamas itself between Mohammed Deif, the head of the military branch, and the leader of Hamas in Gaza, IISS, that few weeks before the clashes started, almost lost and won with very few points the elections in Gaza. He almost lost his position. It was very important for him to give a statement that he is there and he's ready to fight Israel and so on and so forth. So that is one reason. The other reason is, as I said, the difficult situation in Gaza, which is an outcome of economical breakdown, huge unemployment level. On top of that, a very problematic situation of corona that, of course, is not being treated the way which is needed. And all of those, that raised a lot of internal criticisms towards Hamas. Hamas was also looking on the neighbor from the north, i.e. Israel, and he said to himself, this might be a very good time to attack Israel because of the internal political problems that Israel has, elections after elections, the rift between Bibi supporters and those which are standing against Bibi. They thought that this is a good opportunity because now the government is weak and will not dare to retaliate severely against Hamas. Well, they were wrong. And I think that in retrospective point of view, if you would ask them in closed rooms today, Sinwar, Mohammed Deif, actually even publicly they said that they didn't expect this Israeli reaction. And if they would know that this would be the reaction, they would refrain from doing that.
The rocket attack against Israel was really an attack of Hamas against the Palestinian Authority to impose their muscle on it. But they don't fight each other. They're fighting each other, but they're using Israel as cannon fodder for their political battle and their propaganda battle against the hearts and minds of the Palestinians who will be voting for one, two, and the other. Do you agree with that sort of concept?
I fully agree with that, Barry. And thank you for raising that, because this is another crucial factor that explains why these sad events that occurred 2 weeks ago in our region came to be. As we all know, Mahmoud Abbas decided to halt the Palestinian elections. At last, he understood that if he will keep on with this process, he will definitely lose the elections to Hamas. But Hamas was very disappointed and frustrated from his decision because they already felt as if they are taking over the PA administration, the Palestinian Authority administration, the PLO as representatives of the Palestinian people, and all of those goods will fall into their hands, and they were just waiting, and suddenly Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas said, no, we are stopping that. So for them, it was quite natural to start deteriorating the situation with Israel. And they knew that they will not gain any military victory on Israel, but at least they can incite the Palestinian streets, especially in the West Bank, create tension, present themselves as the protectors of the Palestinian people, and at the end of the day, track all of this chaotic situation into demonstrations and the rivalries that we have, that they have with Mahmoud Abbas. I tend to believe that this process is not over, and we would see them making further efforts to achieve that specific goal. And I think that they would challenge Mahmoud Abbas in the coming weeks and months as an immediate outcome of the operation in Gaza.
You examine the progress or the advancement of terror organizations and their methodology. One thing that's not being covered widely in our press or even the foreign press is a new factor that I noticed in the latest Hamas assault on Israel. They launched, for Hamas, a more sophisticated rocket launching style, in which they launched multiple rockets at the same time. I think it was based on their understanding or intelligence that in order to defeat the Israel Iron Dome missile defense shield, you had to fire multiple rockets, because if 10% go through, there were once or twice in which they launched 100 missiles or more at the same time, on the understanding that if 10% goes through, then there would be at least 10 out of 100 minimum that would hit targets. This is an interesting advancement for a terrorist organization. That's one aspect I want you to address. But the other one, of course, is that a spectator of this has been Hezbollah. Now, if you assume that however many rockets that in total that Hamas has, whether it's 10, 15, 20,000, 30,000, it's understood that Hezbollah has somewhere in advance of more than 100,000 rockets, those with more precise warheads guidance, and also with multiple rocket launchers. What would happen if Hezbollah has learned that from that, and if they open up a conflict and they were firing 1,000 rockets at a time, and the Iron Dome in the north could only bring down 10%, that would mean that 100 out of 1,000 would hit their targets. So when you have a war or even a terror attack using missiles, this is also a showplace, a guided place, a test place for the new advancement. We've got to the stage now where Israel's terrorist enemies are now using even more sophisticated rocketry. What's your perception on this?
For your viewers, Barry, let's bring some numbers. During Protective Edge Operation in 2014, the operation in Gaza took 51 days. In those 51 days, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and other fractions of Palestinian terrorist organizations in Gaza have launched altogether about 4,000 rockets in 51 days to Israel. In Guardians of the Wall operation 2 weeks ago, those elements have launched the same number, 4,000 rockets, but not in 51 days, but in 11 days. We believe that if, God forbid, a war would start with Hezbollah, or an overall war in the near future, Hezbollah would launch 4,000 rockets a day. Multiple that in the numbers of days that this war would last. So you can imagine the challenge, the technological challenge, the security challenge that Israel is facing and is going to face in the future. I believe that until now, it was proven Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran that the Iron Dome is even better than our expectations. It was really doing a remarkable job. But one thing, I'm not so sure that it's clear to our enemies, and I don't think it's even clear to the international community. You know, during the operation, after the operation, I've been contacted and interviewed by international media, and time and again, they pose to me this false argumentation as if the Israeli behavior, the Israeli military activity, the Israeli air bombing is non-proportional. I.e., it's on the edge of being a war crime. Why? Because we see high-story buildings fall down, because we see civilian facilities being destroyed, and so on and so forth. Well, that's not the way one analyze what is proportionality in battlefield situation. It's not about the destruction of empty buildings, but not even the numbers or the overall numbers of casualties. Israel has proved during those 11 days, during the operation in Gaza, has proved, I think in an unprecedented manner compared to any other state in the world, that it's very, very cautious and doing whatever is possible and a little more in order to protect the lives of the Palestinian civilians in Gaza. Actually, I do believe that the Israeli authorities cared for the lives of the Palestinians in Gaza much more than Hamas authorities care for the life of their own people. Just in brackets, they bragging about the fact that they've built 500 kilometers of underground tunnels in Gaza. Well, I would ask the question, how many of those kilometers of tunnels have been used as bomb shelter for civilians? The answer is zero. They didn't let any civilian to get into the underground terrace and protect themselves from so-called Israeli vicious bombing. But Israel created those procedures of knock on the roof, phone calls to the citizens and the people which are living in those buildings that are going to be hit, in order to warn them and to tell them to evacuate the building and to keep their lives. But my point here has to do with the Iron Dome. Now, you know, it's ridiculous that the international community is saying you had a dozen people that died during those 11 days, and the Palestinians had a few hundreds altogether. That's a non-proportional behavior. And I would say, what do you expect? If we didn't have the Iron Dome, and those 4,000 rockets would fall as they plan to do on the civilian building and houses all over Israel, in Tel Aviv, in other cities, Ashkelon, Ashdod, and others, and we would have thousands of casualties, then the same numbers of victims in Gaza would be regarded as proportional. Let me share with you the way I see it. The Iron Dome is not just protecting the lives of the Israeli civilians. The Iron Dome protects the lives of the Palestinian civilians. And what do I mean by that? Because if, God forbid, we wouldn't have the Iron Dome, Israel would have reoccupied Gaza a long time ago. And that would cause, unfortunately, many, many casualties among the Palestinian civilians, among the Israeli soldiers, among Hamas activists, not hundreds, thousands of them. So the international community should praise Israel for having the Iron Dome that protect the lives of the Israeli citizens and the Palestinian citizens at the same time. And for Hezbollah and Iran, I would say, if you're sitting on the fence and counting numbers and trying to find a way to deceive the Israeli technology, the Iron Dome, you should keep the Iron Dome working as much as possible, because in the next war in Lebanon, if you would be able to swamp the Israeli Iron Dome and to deactivate it, it the way you want and inflict a lot of harm and casualties in the Israeli home front, you would suffer from much bigger number of casualties when Israel will try to protect itself and to stop this war crime of launching rockets intentionally towards the home front and not towards military bases or military targets altogether.
Boaz, remind me, I think in the last conflict we had with Hamas, if I remember the numbers, Palestinians were claiming over 3,000 casualties. In this one, where the Israeli bombing was certainly more intensive, including one-ton bunker busting bombs in order to smash up the terror exits and entrances, which are all located in heavily populated areas. The highest figures that the Palestinian Ministry of Health seemed to come up with is somewhere around 300. That's a tenth of what it was years ago, despite the more intense bombing required by the IDF. And this only points to the, some people call it the miracle of precise bombing over here, that we hit in vast amount of times the intended targets and to the minimum civilian casualties. And then the figures as well, given by the people abroad, or even by the Palestinian media, they don't take into consideration the 600, 700 Hamas rockets, which misfired and short fell into Palestinians, to Gaza and heavily populated areas, thereby injuring and killing many Palestinians, killed by Hamas rockets and not by Israeli counterfire. That's one aspect that doesn't get covered. Maybe you want to make a quick comment on that before I get on to the next question.
Actually, I just want to echo what you have said. By our calculation, the vast majority of the small number of the Palestinian civilians that have been killed or injured during the Guardians of the Wall operation in Gaza, most of them were killed by Hamas rockets that fell too short. They've been launched from the southern part of Gaza Strip towards Israel, but they fell in the northern part of Gaza Strip on civilian neighborhoods and buildings. So only in due time we would know the exact numbers that those rockets actually caused, the number of casualties that they caused. But this is something that I think will take the international community by surprise if they would be ready to pay attention. But unfortunately, they are not interested in that.
Yeah, Boaz, you gave me a tip, because it's one thing I never thought of and never used before. The fact that you mentioned that Hamas claim they have 500 kilometers or even more of tunnels. By the way, that's more kilometers than the London Underground has, but never mind, let's take their word for it. The fact that they could have used it in order to house their civilians, and they can't say, well, they didn't have the siren system in advance, because Israel gave them the siren system, because they never attacked civilian areas until they were assured there were no civilians there. They did it by dropping leaflets, by making phone calls, by the knock on the roof tactic of moving the civilians out before they attacked. In several cases, they waited 3 hours to attack certain serious buildings to do it. And yes, the Hamas did have the opportunity to move their civilians underground. That's quite right, as you quite rightly said. They didn't do it. What I've been seeing as somebody from the Israel Institute of Strategic Studies is that we are seeing not only less support from democratic countries, but quite often support for Hamas from democratic countries. Let me give you 2 or 3 examples. We saw democratic members of Congress standing up in the Congress, standing in Congress building in order to say they support Hamas resistance. The new member, the new foreign minister for Holland is a well-known activist for Hamas against Israel. She is now the foreign minister for Holland. And we saw with the United Nations Human Rights Council a call, an overwhelming vote, including from several European nations, for Israel to be investigated for war crimes over the latest incidents when we were responding to 4,000 Hamas rockets. Israel should be investigated for war crimes and not an Islamic terror organization.
Well, this is a huge challenge, and I'm happy to say that we at the ICT and the Interdisciplinary Center are taking this challenge very seriously. I tend to believe that what we face, which is a growing criticism, hatred, anti-Semitism in the world that was expressed during the operation, is a phenomenon which is just going to intensify.
Boaz, I was interested in some of the examples you gave about where of the Hasbara. You mentioned the IDC Hasbara effort going back a few years. I was one of those that was instrumental with Jonathan Davis and others in setting up what we call the Situation Room at IDC. And this was the time of the Mavi Marmara attack. If you remember, the Turkish ship that was full of terrorists who was heading to Gaza. That was one way in which we created websites. And because of the IDC international students, we created it in various languages. And we started putting out material that went out to quite a lot of countries. And we received a lot of support, pro-Israel support. In fact, if you're interested in an example of intelligence coming out of Good Hasbara, part of what one of the students did, he picked up on a group from Belgium who were recruiting people to come to Israel of what they call not the flotilla, but the flytilla. They were going to fly into Ben Gurion Airport in various planes from various airports, mainly from Belgium and Germany. And at Ben Gurion Airport, start unfurling Palestinian flags and pouring a ruckus. Well, fortunately, because of that, because I had some sort of involved or people in intelligence, Israeli intelligence, we gave the information into Israeli intelligence, and about 160 people were prevented from flying to Israel. That comes out of practical use of counterterrorism, if you want to call that, coming out of a Hasbara efforts. Really incited me to write a book which was called Fighting Hamas, BDS and Anti-Semitism, which is very relevant today, especially as we're seeing on the streets of Europe and the United States with the attack on Jews as a result of the Hamas bombardment. So this is all part of where, if it was a carefully constructed, call it Hasbara effort, call it information campaign, call it counterterrorism, where the truth about Israel and the things we're doing should be fed into a lot of the governments via their intelligence people, via their national security people, into the politicians themselves, we could easily win this battle. Does it make sense to you to keep a designated Islamic terror organization in situ? Basically, they're controlling the Gaza Strip. Nobody else is controlling it. They have virtually clearly defined borders with Egypt in the south, Israel in the north, and the Mediterranean Sea in the west. They control the population. They control the budget. They operate out of the Gaza city, which could be for them their capital. And yet, instead of disposing of an international terror organization, we're being told we have to keep them in place. I wonder whether America would do that if Al-Qaeda was occupying Cuba, for instance, or even ISIS. I doubt it. So there seems to be a double standard here between the United States, the European Union, and even the United Nations. My question to you is basically this. What sort of solution is possible if you want a peaceful Middle East where the democratic world is maintaining a designated Islamic terror organization in situ who claim to represent the Palestinians? Coming to the truth of saying there can be no possible move forward with regard to peace and a solution with the Palestinians, as long as you have an unrepentant terror organization controlling territory as they do in the Gaza Strip. And it could be done with the international community, with Israel, with the moderate Arab states, members of the Abraham Accord, with countries like Jordan and with Egypt, in fact, joining in as well, in imposing a completely different regime of progressive, pragmatic, prosperous leadership in the Gaza Strip, and using the Gaza Strip as a model for what a future Palestinian state, if you want that, to look like. There was a plan, an Israeli plan, as you well know, in which we were talking about putting a port in Gaza, putting an island off the shores of Gaza with an airport, with a bridge connecting it with Gaza. Those plans were put out by Israel at the time. Certainly can't be done with Hamas there. So I am looking for a moral solution for the solution. And I come back to Einstein. It is absolutely insane to say the status quo must carry on as before. And this is being done by people who are imposing a two-state solution between Israel and the Palestinian. And they always do it by imposing a two-state solution between Israel and the Palestinian leadership, Mahmoud Abbas, in Ramallah, as if the big elephant, tiger in the room, Hamas, doesn't exist. It's time for reality in order to find a solution.
Well, I take it as you say that this is maybe the challenge of the century, and this challenge has to do with the changing hearts and minds of the international community, the public at large, and their decision makers. I think there is a good improvement in our own region, as you mentioned, the Abraham agreements and understanding that the UAE has Bahrain and other states that are interested in promoting better life for the Palestinians, but also acknowledge the right of Israel to exist, acknowledge the right of Israel for security, and respect the Israeli borders and so on and so forth. So that's a good start in this regard. But I think that the Palestinians at large needs to go a long way until they would be ready to sit down and find some common ground for an accepted solution by both sides. I'm afraid that even the moderate Palestinians are still far from reaching that understanding. And as an Israeli, I cling to that hope that this would happen. Of course, we at ICT are trying to do our best, not just to create better policies and practices in counterterrorism, but also to build some trust, if not directly with Palestinians, then definitely with Arab countries that become more alluded to the Israeli needs and become, in a way, more neutral in their approach to the conflict.
I want to also remind our viewers that Israel withdrew from Gaza many years ago. We forcefully evicted 9,000 Israelis, Jewish Israelis from Gaza. And when we walked out of there, we left behind for the Palestinian an agricultural paradise. That was just before the civil war, in which Hamas went to war against Fatah. And you could talk about this. And the result of that is what we have in Gaza, which is not good for us, not good for the Arab, not good for anybody. Comes back to what I said before. But moving it forward, isn't it strange that basically the international community have not really addressed something that you're an expert on, and that is the hybrid nature of Hamas, not being properly addressed by foreign governments, the hybrid control over Gaza that uses aid, money, equipment and everything in order, supposedly for the benefit of the civilians in Gaza, but it's always hijacked and purloined by Hamas to pursue their terrorist ends. Speak to us a little bit about the hybrid nature of terror organizations like Hamas.
With pleasure. I believe I was one of the first, if not the first, scholar that used the term hybrid terrorist organization. It was in my previous book, Global Alert. I wrote there that we should classify, we should have a certain type of a typology between different types of terrorist organizations. The classical terrorist organization, which is a small organization based on operational networks under the intelligence radar, occupied in one thing and one thing only, which is conducting terrorist attacks altogether. But some, not many, some of those organizations through the years evolved to become a hybrid terrorist organization. Let's double click on the term hybrid terrorist organization and explain what it is. A hybrid terrorist organization is a terrorist organization that controls territory and population. On top of being a terrorist organization and conducting terrorist activity, the hybrid terrorist organization has other concerns in mind as well. They need to supply the constituency that they control, the population that they control, they supply them with basic services, food, water, electricity. They need to care for law enforcement activity, education, and so on and so forth. This is not very typical for terrorist organizations, but also they misuse the population that they control, and they use them as human shields, as we see in Gaza, as we see in Lebanon and other places altogether. The two most famous hybrid terrorist organizations nowadays, in my view, is Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon. Until a few years ago, one should refer to ISIS in Syria and Iraq also as a hybrid terrorist organization. But in the recent years, they lost their hybridity because they lost their territory. One of the main problems dealing with a hybrid terrorist organization is that this terrorist organization claims to be a legitimate entity. Why? Because they control population. In some cases, they are even being elected, sometimes even forcefully elected by this constituency. And as such, they claim that they are a legitimate entity and should be regarded as a political party, as a government, as a state, and so on and so forth. And many Westerners are falling into that trap in a way, and giving them the benefit of the doubt, and even more than that, giving them this legitimacy that they claim. You know, when I sent my book, the Global Alert, quite a long time ago, to the publisher, academic publisher, he sent that naturally to reviewers. One of the reviewers wrote criticism about the book, and he said, first of all, I don't know what is this term hybrid terrorist organization, never heard about that. But the main case study of this book is Hamas, and Hamas, quote unquote, is a questionable terrorist organization. Now, actually, in his criticism, he was proving my argument. My argument was that hybrid terrorist organizations are deceiving the world and become so-called questionable terrorist organizations. Well, we need to take out the question of that questionable terrorist organization. We need to make it very clear, and we need to say it loud and clear. And when I say we, I refer to the international community. Terrorism is terrorism is terrorism. When you deliberate attack civilians, when you aim your fires towards civilian cities, neighborhoods, and facilities, you are a terrorist organization. At the same time, you could be a political party, you could be an army, you could be a pseudo state or whatever, but you are still a terrorist organization. And this is something that we at the ICT are explaining our counterparts and decision makers all over the world.
Well, talk about your book, and just to show you, Boaz, how I'm up on your writing. About 7 years ago, you wrote about what you said, the rationality of modern Islamic terrorism and the challenges to the liberal democratic world. What was your message in that? And do you think that applies to both Hamas and Hezbollah? Do they fit into your theory?
Very much so. My claim was the terrorists in general, and of course I'm generalizing here, and there are a few exceptions, but terrorists in general are rational actors. Now, in order to prove my claim, we need to try to agree what is a rational decision-making process. So I would argue that the rational decision-making process is a process in which one calculates costs and benefits of different alternatives of behavior, different policies, if you wish, and is choosing the alternative which he believes is more beneficial than costly. That's a rational decision-making process. The main problem is that this calculus of cost and benefits is a subjective calculus. It differs from person to person, from community to community, from culture to culture, from religion to religion, because it's based on our set of values, on our ideology, on our goals and interests, and so on and so forth. And you can imagine that my goals and my set of values is different than Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's or Nasrallah or whoever. So the main challenge, in my view, for a counterterrorism expert is to be able to open his own head, to take out from his head his own calculus of costs and benefits, which is based on his culture and goals and interests and so on and so forth, and where instead of his own calculus, the calculus of the enemy, of the adversary, of the terrorist organization. That's the main challenge, because without that, we don't have the tools which are needed in order to deter them, in order to change their behavior, in order to force them to do something. First and foremost, we need to understand their rationale. Going back to your question, I think that Hamas and Hezbollah are super rational in their behavior. They have a calculus of cost and benefits, but sometimes we attribute our own calculus to them, and then we refer to their behavior as an irrational behavior. I can explain every move of Hamas, every move of Hezbollah in the recent years, time and again, based on their own calculus of costs and benefits. By the way, this is the best news I could give you, because if they are rational, then we can have the ability to influence and impact their activity, either by deterrence, by persuasion, by threatening them, and so on and so forth.
I'm still not sure that you could convert Mohammed Def into Mother Teresa, but or even Gandhi, but we all live in hope. Let's end up this thing. We've had a year of lockdown, and one of the things that we've suffered from, and I've suffered from, is not being able to go to very important conferences at which I network and I learn a lot. And I'm hoping, I think that later this year, I'll be able to attend your next annual counter-terrorism conference in IDC Herzliya. What can you tell us about it? Who's going to be on the program? What's going to be the aim of this conference? And how do people register for it?
Thank you for asking, Barry. And you're already familiar with this World Summit on Counterterrorism that we conduct on an annual basis at the IDC Herzliya. But this year, it's going to be bigger, stronger, and much more worthwhile to make the effort and come. It's always on the week of the 11th of September. So this year, it would also start on the 11th of September until the 14th. It's between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And I would urge definitely everybody who lives in Israel and interested in the subject, but also your viewers from all over the world, to make the effort and come to Israel and celebrate the end of the corona crisis with taking part in this World Summit of Counterterrorism. Every year, and this coming year, we are going to have about 1,000 participants, including about 100 speakers. a very unique combination of speakers, heads of states. Usually we have the prime minister, we have the relevant and important ministers from the Israeli government, but also from other governments as well, heads of national security council, heads of security agencies and law enforcement agencies from different parts of the world, and also together with scholars and lay leaders that will discuss all the security aspects in the region, in the Middle East, but also the global perspectives of terrorism, counterterrorism, and security affairs. This is very interesting time. It's a time of transition after the coronavirus, with the interest of terrorist organizations to be involved in non-conventional terrorist activities, biological activities, and others. It's very interesting as Iran is reaching the level of the edge of being nuclearized. And actually created a huge threat in the overall Middle East, conventional and non-conventional threat to many states, including Israel. It's interesting because of the positive change of hearts among some Muslim countries, and we do expect to have representative of those new friends of Israel that signed the Abraham Accords with Israel also take part in this particular conference. And also we are marking the 25th anniversary of ICT and the 20th International Summit in this event. So it's going to be bigger than ever and worthwhile more than ever to participate in. So just if you're interested, just get into the website of the International Institute for Counterterrorism, register, and we will see you in Israel sooner than later.
Thank you, Boaz. And I, for one, look forward to participating or being at the conference, and we will certainly upload the link for you viewers to get information on Boaz's conference in September. Hope to see you there. And Boaz, thank you for joining me. You ended up with a note on Iran. That is a subject that's worthy to stand on its own two legs. So maybe I'll have the honor of also talking to you about that at a later date as well, because there's a lot to take in on that one. But thank you very much, Boaz, for joining me today. Thank you, Boaz. And viewers, if you... My pleasure, my pleasure. Thank you, Boaz. And viewers, if you enjoyed this talk, if you enjoyed Boaz's contribution and thoughts and ideas and observations, please click like on the video, and please share with other people as well. And we look forward to seeing you in another version of The View from Israel. Thank you very much. This is Barry Shaw saying goodbye.
Thank you.
אנחנו מכריזים בזאת